In one of my past videos, I think it was this one about dystopian literature and the rise of fascism, I had this idea that I kind of kept coming back to, that in media, the fascists will always wear black robes. And I kind of made the case in that video that this is potentially damaging to our understanding of real-life politics, particularly for people who get most of their understanding of politics from media, because in real life, the fascists are not always so easy to spot, or they come in different forms. And while that is true, I wanted to take that the fascists wore black robes idea a little bit more literally, and spend some time looking at the actual fashion of fascism, particularly through the lens of Andor. And to get started on that, I need to begin by focusing not on fashion necessarily, but still on optics and aesthetics, specifically the optics of the Empire in Andor. So I remember a time back in 2017, back in the good old days when there were no problems, any at all, and I read an article on my phone. I remember I was sitting in bed, I'm like, what is this? And I opened it, and it was some, I don't know, clickbait rage about a quote from a writer, Chris Weitz, who was one of the guys who worked on the screenplay for Rogue One. And he was tweeting in response to something political related about a certain guy, Donald Trump. And Chris Weitz said, "Please note that the Empire is a white supremacist human organization." And I remember when I read that, I was like, what does white supremacy have to do with the Empire? What's this stupid liberal saying? That doesn't make any sense at all. What a dumb thing to tweet. But, like, I get it now that I'm a grown-up, because the idea behind the Empire is that they are, of course, Nazis. And the Nazis are, of course, white supremacists. So, now pivoting to Andor specifically, the Empire does not consist of all white characters, but that's not really the point. The Empire consists entirely of human characters, whereas the rebellion is always a multi-special coalition of different cultures and people and aliens and whatnot from different planets across the galaxy, all coming together despite their many differences to team up and overthrow an autocratic regime. The Empire then itself maintains a very strict and rigid hierarchy which you can only move up through based on certain circumstances, and Andor takes the unique approach in the Star Wars canon of examining what, like, a low-level clerk basically life would be like under the Empire, or while working for the Empire. And we see this through two specific characters. The character of Dedra and the character of Cyril, who are both trying to work their way up through the Empire, but do so in different ways. Specifically for Dedra, she is not taken seriously by her fellow Imperialists, like nobody ever listens to her, and she's constantly getting in trouble for being too emotional. And she's also always in trouble for trying to rise above her status, even though, as she points out to Krennic, she only has to rise above her status because nobody's trusting her with the information materials that she needs, even though she is almost always right about whatever situation is going on with the rebellion. Nobody ever listens to her, and even though she is the villain, like, from the Empire's point of view, and the audience is like, people should listen to her because she knows what's up, but she's not taken seriously. Now, I'm not going to say that's exclusively because she is a woman, but I think that she is one of the only female officers, and specifically the only female officer that the saga ever focuses on. I definitely think that it's obviously an element. Specifically, Krennic and even her boyfriend and fellow loser Cyril treat her in ways that they do not treat the other Imperial underlings. Like, Krennic is very physical with her and does that to make her feel small, and he never really does this to anybody else, to any other men. And while yes, Darth Vader does choke out that one guy in A New Hope, that's different. That's not Andor. And even Cyril himself, the one time he actually really asserts himself and tries to stick up for himself or stand up against Dedra, he chokes her out, and I can guarantee that Cyril would not have done that to another man. Yes, he does get into a fistfight with Andor, but the power dynamic there and the imagery is very different than the way Cyril treats Dedra in this scene. And yet both Dedra and Cyril are kind of the highest, some of the most important antagonists in Andor, and yet they are losers. They constantly fail, and they constantly get kicked aside by the Empire they are so desperate to serve. And this is something that's very important, and which I'll be coming back to several times, so keep that in mind. These two characters stand out in really stark contrast to somebody like, say, Darth Vader, who is famous for being cool. He's always farming aura and doing crazy stuff. But the villains in Andor, especially the Imperial villains like Dedra and Cyril, are not cool. Young men idolize Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader, as I talked about in my Stars video, because they're cool, they're tragic and complex, and that does not apply to the villains in Andor. And this is important in the context of how Andor understands its subject material, real-life fascism and rebellions, because it depowers the fascist characters, as appearing cool and structured is key to fascists maintaining power and recruiting new people into, well, their fascisting. There we go. And that imagery of structure and hierarchy and coolness is, of course, propaganda. Propaganda always being key to a fascist or an autocratic regime. For example, we have my favorite, who I always love to talk about, the girl boss, Leni Riefenstahl, whose main job was to make the Nazis look cool, specifically through cutting-edge filmmaking technology. Other aspects of Nazi Germany, like the Hitler Youth, the uniforms, make people and society at every level want to be a part of the government structure at the time. So much so to the point where there is no distinguishing your own personal life and belonging and existence from the government. Your belonging and existence is defined by and for the government. A book which covered this really well is Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins, which I talked about on my channel a little bit ago, and you can watch that video here if you want to. Now, with all of that said as a bit of preamble, before we get into before we get into things deeper, like fashion, we need to talk specifically about what fascism is, because it has a very fluid definition, and every video that I make which talks about it, somebody's always fucking mad and complaining about the definition. So I'm going to get out of the way right now that depending on which country, time, and region you are looking at, the definition of fascism is going to change. However, there are still several agreed upon, I guess mostly agreed upon aspects of fascism which are present in Andor and all real-life fascist regimes. So here's the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of fascism, which I don't think is perfect, but here's more or less what we're going to be using. A populist political philosophy, movement, or regime, such as that of the fascisti, that exalts nation and often race above the individual, that is associated with a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, and that is characterized by severe economic and social regimentation and by forcible suppression of opposition. There you go. There's more to it, though, such as the fact that fascist hierarchies usually are really focused on maintaining that hierarchy, and specifically maintaining that hierarchy through racial purity, sometimes maybe religion or anti-religion, but really by controlling and maintaining whatever the cultural status is of any culture, basically, whether it be through art or through fashion or media or whatever. Key points to remember, though, are that the individual does not exist when compared to or divorced from the nation. The nation comes before everything, and a need for a shared cultural identity quickly emerges to keep people complacent and in line. Theorist/author Walter Benjamin talked about this a lot in his work, The Aestheticization of Politics, writing, "Fascism attempts to organize the newly proletarianized masses without affecting the property structure which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while preserving property. The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life." There's a lot to unpack there, but the basic idea is that fascist regimes take over art and politics and culture in order to make people feel like they are claiming their own agency, while really just tricking them into a force-fed agency, which is mandated by the imperial or fascist structure. Benjamin and many other people also connected fascism to the Italian futurist movement, which blends technology and art and culture into basically a utopian setting and world. Fascism likes to appropriate these images without doing any of the actual work necessary to create a real and genuine and egalitarian utopia. But in fascism, you also need to focus on that imagery and specifically use things like military parades as a show of force and of power and a celebration of said military. This is all covered very, very well in a YouTube video called The New Aesthetics of Fascism, which is a sequel to just The Aesthetics of Fascism, which you should definitely check out because I'll be referencing both videos several times throughout the rest of this video. Which makes me need to now address whether or not the Empire in Star Wars, and specifically Andor, is in fact fascist. Basically, yes, but if you're getting into the nitty-gritty and the actual semantics of fascism, I don't think it lines up perfectly. Referring back to our definition, it does have a social hierarchy, and it does have an autocratic figure at the head of things, and it does forcibly suppress opposition, and it does try to control most aspects of its citizens' life. But unlike real-world fascism, the Empire and Palpatine himself don't really have an ideology. And you can make the case that most fascist regimes don't have a specific ideology, but broadly they coalesce around certain things like national protection, fake populism, and a disliking of some kind of minority or outgroup. And the Empire, like, kind of has that with the Jedi or just anyone who doesn't fit in. But it is fake, and mostly Palpatine just, like, wants control because... well, and we see that then translate downwards to all of the Imperial underlings who are important in Andor, whether it be Cyril or this guy from Game of Thrones or Orson Krennic. The closest we get to a defined ideology for the Empire in Andor is basically just control. Even Dedra says to Luthen that,
hiding in the shelter of Imperial peace and quiet, you disgust me. Freedom. You don't want freedom. You want chaos. Chaos for everyone but you. Ruin the galaxy and then run back to your ridiculous wig and little workshop.
Dedra and Cyril are both really focused on order and the meticulous nature and structure of things, and they don't like anything which challenges that very specific order. And I guess kind of like at its simplest form, that's what fascism is built around. It wants to control and maintain some kind of order, and anything which is different or a threat to that order is no good.
The Imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort.
The Empire is not a perfect representation of a fascist regime, especially in the modern sense. It's a really good representation of an autocratic regime, and there's still plenty of things to learn from it, but if you want to get a really good example of a real-life fascist regime, well, just study real life, I guess. Which now finally brings me to fascism and fashion. As I already kind of touched on, fascism needs iconography and uniformity in order to be appealing for a variety of reasons. In Italy, this began with the Blackshirts, Mussolini's goons, infiltrating every aspect of life, and people wearing or being forced to wear black shirts as a way of showing their allegiance to the culture and to the fascist regime being run by Mussolini. This is covered very well in this video called Fascists Have No Drip, The History of Fashion in Fascist Italy, so if you want to get really specific, check out this video because it's epic. But regarding Mussolini, I found this quote from him, but I had trouble verifying it from multiple sources, so take it with a grain of salt, whether or not it can actually be attributed to him. I found it in different translations elsewhere, so I think the gist is true. But anyways, the content is what's important. Fascism conceives of the state as an absolute, in comparison with which all individual groups are relative, only to be conceived in relation to the state. And then building on that, author Susan Sontag said that fascist aesthetics flow from and justify a preoccupation with situations of control, submissive behavior, extravagant effort, and the endurance of pain. They endorse two seemingly opposite states, egomania and servitude. The relations of domination and enslavement take the form of a characteristic pageantry, the massing of groups of people, the turning of people into things, the multiplication or replication of things, and the grouping of people or things around an all-powerful, hypnotic leader figure or force. The fascist dramaturgy centers on the orgiastic transactions between mighty forces and their puppets, uniformly garbed and shown in ever-swelling numbers. Its choreography alternates between ceaseless motion and a congealed, static, virile posing. Fascist art glorifies surrender. It exalts mindlessness. It glamorizes death. And another thing to acknowledge when looking at the structure and aesthetics of fascism is that it shares a lot of similarities with cults. Cults and fascist regimes are both built around specific iconography, beliefs, and most importantly, the persuasive force of a strong central leader, typically, if not almost always, a man. Once again, the aesthetics of fascism by Ben Horman cover this really well, so here's a clip from that.
It's no coincidence that fascists are just as obsessed with aesthetics as cults are. Both understand the emotional, even timeless power visuals have. The strong men at the center of a fascist regime or a cult are often projecting. They're typically not at all the image which they wish to fulfill. For example, Hitler was famously weak and ill all the time, not virile, didn't have any children, he was not even Aryan. You see this a lot with the Donald Trump AI slop, and an interesting aspect of this is covered in the work The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer, which I can already hear people
fucking clicking away on their keyboards. Because every time I mention the rise and fall of the Third Reich, people are like, not a good source. And I recognize there are other sources out there. But I bring it up in this context because one of the reasons that the rise and fall of the Third Reich is looked upon somewhat negatively in the wider historiography of its own existence is due to the outdated manner in which Shire talks about homosexuality and the homosexual tendencies of Hitler's inner circle. And, well, yeah, it's not the most gentle. The topic is still relevant because while Shire attributes a lot of the Nazi deviancy potentially to homosexuality, the fact remains that the Nazis projected this image of strong, virile, heterosexual men, but beyond just that, they were never as strong as they projected or wanted to be. And so for that fact, I think that Shire's work and other works which cover the same topic are important, because fascism is based on a projection of an image which doesn't exist, particularly an image which its own creators don't even align with. And this is something also that's notable in something even like Harry Potter, which is not the most complex work or exploration of fascism, but the character of Voldemort, who wants and advocates for a pure-blooded wizarding society, is himself of, mixed blood. One of his parents is a non-magic user, and I think that's really important when deconstructing the nature of fascism, especially if you want to confront it and defeat it in the real world. You need to remember that it is all a lie, that it's not real, that it's a projection of something fake. And that is why AI is such an important new tool for the modern aesthetics and purposes of fascism. And just one of the many reasons why I want to say emphatically right here, fuck AI, because it is 100% being propped up and used by technocrats who are currently in line with the US Fascist Party to dumb down culture and to play into that projection of things which are not real. This is all, again, covered really well in the new aesthetics of fascism. We see this translate to Star Wars as well. Similar to how Voldemort is not of pure blood, Vader is not actually strong. Like, without his suit, he dies. He's a weak, sad, lonely, pathetic man who can use the Force, yes, but take that away, and he's nothing. And while the Empire is trying to project strength through basically militaristic action, the Emperor himself is not necessarily always trying to appear strong and virile, but again, it's fiction and the idea still applies pretty well. But the Empire, just like real-life fascist regimes, does rely on a kind of state-mandated form of identity, which they drive largely through fashion. Author Mari Lupano, who wrote a book on this subject, gave an internet voice where he said, "Our book isn't about the fascists and their uniforms, but about fashion in the 20 years the Italians lived under fascism. What's interesting is the way that fascism, modernism, and fashion all influence each other. We wanted to look at the uniformity as an aesthetic and the ways that order, rationality, and technical control became really important. There's a lot of totalitarianism in fashion, the big dreams and ambitions, the sense of new beginnings, the attempts to define an epoch." Then the interviewer says, "The Italian fascists seem to be really obsessed with the body." At which point, Lupano then continues, "They're obsessed with measuring bodies. The introduction of standard sizes, the rise of plastic surgery, an upsurge in exercise, and an awareness of body image were all part of an attempt to master the body and build the new humanity fascists were dreaming of." In an article called The Power of Dress by Bella Testa, this idea is explored further as Testa writes, "Fascists realized that fashion played an important role in their propaganda because it was something they could control all aspects of, from producing the textiles to publishing fashion collections and magazines. Around the same time, Nazi Germany was also experimenting with fascist fashion. Hitler created the German Fashion Institute to counter the French and other foreign fashion movements that contrasted his views of women in fashion." Testa continues, "Similar to Hitler, Mussolini also despised French fashion. He disliked the newfound freedoms women possessed during and after World War I and wanted to revert back to the patriarchal society. As a result, Mussolini launched La Nuova Italiana, which is known as the New Italian Woman. According to the La Nuova Italiana, women should wear clothes that are glamorous, sophisticated, and hyper-feminine, in contrast with more masculine clothes women were starting to wear at the time." And we're seeing this in the United States in a variety of ways as fashion and fascism start to kind of mix a little bit. So to get back to Andor again now and talk about specifically the fashion in Andor, there's a lot to say. Beginning with the fact that the guys working in the Empire are all dweebs. Like, no hate, but these are not like strong, young, handsome, virile, powerful, strong men. These are bureaucrats sitting in a room, doing nothing, wearing goofy outfits, and making other people do the dirty work for them. They've got no aura, they've got no riz, unlike Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker. Again, they're not all necessarily white or even all necessarily men, but what's most important in the context of Star Wars is that they're all human. They dress uniformly, lack identity, they're hard to tell apart, and they lack cool masculinity. The Imperial fashion infects every aspect of Imperial life, and there's some really interesting insight given into this by the costume designer for the show, Michael Wilkinson. Talking specifically about Dedra, he says, "She gets home. She's probably super relieved to take off the armor of the ISB highly tailored uniform. But in a way, she just sort of changes into another version of that. The colors are the same. She slips into clothes that are more comfortable, but also in a structured and formal way. She keeps that rigidity even in her private life. She believes so much in her morality and ethics that I think she can't ever let that slip. Her mentality is very black and white. I think she only wears ivory and black this whole season." Those ideas pretty much apply to Cyril as well. Cyril is a pathetic beta who almost never advocates for himself, gets bullied by his mom all the time, and constantly licks the boot of the Empire. His mom even makes fun of how he dresses, and there's this long scene about the length and width of his collar. As mentioned earlier, the closest thing Cyril has to like a cool, assertive moment is when he chokes his girlfriend and I guess coworker Dedra. It's not cool in the way it's cool when Vader chokes that one guy in A New Hope. It's just horrible and pathetic. And well, yeah, Dedra is like a horrible person and is allowing genocide to happen and is profiting from it. Like, this is still not good imagery, right? And in fact, Cyril is so dedicated to the idea of capturing Cassian Andor and making a name for himself in the Empire and rising through the ranks and being successful and proving himself to his mother and to his uncle and to Dedra, that the plot punishes him in the most severe way it possibly can. In its final episode in Season 2, when Cyril finally gets Andor and tries to fight him and has the opportunity to shoot him, Andor is just confused. Cassian looks him in the eye and says, "Who are you?"
The state is meant to give men the illusion of being respected as individual persons, even though we all know the individual doesn't matter to them at all. Just a statistic, a tool to serve the nation's interests. But to keep the machine running, you must believe in the myth of noble sacrifice, the honor of giving a body for a cause, when in reality, you might die for something that never cared about you.
Cyril is the embodiment of how characters do not exist when divorced of the Empire, either as a citizen or as an employee. Cyril and Dedra spend their entire lives, they dedicate everything towards working for the Empire, and they earn nothing. They are in fact punished for what they contribute. Here's a clip from a video called The Suckers and Losers of Fascism by Altwordly, which highlights this idea really, really well.
I think we should walk a mile in Connor's skin suit. Look through his glazed over eyes. There you are. You're Connor. You thought you were going to end up feeling big and strong, like the images of Trump. Well, the fake ones that hide how fat he is. Or the fake images of Hitler that showed him being strong and not a nasty little gremlin. Or the fake pictures of Putin doing that exact same thing. You thought you were going to look like those fake pictures of those real guys. But now look at yourself. You're a no-job loser, literally begging wealthy people for money. If a black person did this, you'd call them a criminal.
Cyril lives in pathetic denial. It doesn't really matter in his final moments, at least to me, that he lowers his gun. He's had so many opportunities to be with his people and do the right thing, and he took none of them. And regarding his costumes, again, costume designer Michael Wilkinson here is saying, here's a person that is perhaps not the most expressive open character, but we liken it to the first time you ever traveled to Europe. You arrive somewhere and everything seems so culturally rich. They have a sense of tradition and pride about their history. And so I like to think that as Cyril lived on Gorman, he was affected by the clothing there. He wanted a little bit of Gorman flavor for himself. He has a long, rich, dark brown woolen coat, and he styles it up with beautiful velvet scars and a beret. In a way, he's found his people. It's like, finally, people who appreciate the difference between a collar that's 1 centimeter higher. But again, unfortunately for Cyril, by the time he finds his people who appreciate fashion as an individual expression the way he wants to, it's too late, because he sacrifices all that shit for the Empire, which crushes out the individualized aspect of fashion and self-expression.
Dehumanizing people and turning them into tools to serve the state or a leader is a fundamental goal of fascist aesthetics. But how do you sell that? How do you convince people to give up their freedom, their autonomy? by glorifying it.
And this is why I say that Andor really understands and depowers the fashion of the Empire in ways that even something like Rogue One doesn't, by making Vader look horrifying but also badass, and in a way exalts the dark side and therefore the Empire and fascism. However, Andor makes the Empire and fascism look really boring and lame, and instead puts the cool focus in the order farming on Andor and the rest of the rebellion, as it should.
Fascists hype themselves up to go mask off because they're told it'll make them cool and badass and awesome. But without the mask, their ugliness is exposed. Why do the ice guys wear masks, by the way? What they're doing is legal, right? Well, it's because under their masks, all the ice guys look like Papa Connors. They're schlubs. That's not problematic. I'm a schlub too. It takes one to know one. But I've seen what happens to schlubs who go the other way. They become Andrew Tate in his house arrest for sex trafficking era. ICE agents are almost to a person the opposite of the alpha male archetype they so desperately want to achieve. I say to a person because there are a lot of women ICE agents too. And when they wear those masks, they get to enter the false reality fascism creates, one in which our enemies are simultaneously pathetic weaklings, but also all-powerful.
And to that point further, there are moments on the show where the Empire and the Stormtroopers aren't just like incompetent, boring bureaucrats. There are times where they're lethal and when they're effective, but I wouldn't say that translates necessarily to them being cool. More so, they're horrifying and unambiguously evil. This massacre in the Gorman Plaza is not something to be idolized or celebrated. Like, it's scary and it's horrific. The Imperial officer who has the most aura, if you want to call it that, is of course Krennic, but he's not necessarily cool. Again, he's more frightening and weird. Like when he does this weird, like when he pokes Dedra on the head and is just being like a freak all the time. The coolest characters, both in terms of attitude and fashion, are, as I mentioned, the rebels, specifically Cassian and Luthen. But Andor also uses fashion to highlight how the rich try to remain ambivalent and above the conflict, specifically through the character of Mon Mothma and kind of all the stuff that's going on her planet during the wedding and these party scenes, in contrast to how characters like Andor and his friends have to live while actually fighting their rebellion. Here's another good quote from Michael Wilkinson discussing this. "We want it to feel incredibly real. Our characters are all humans, and so there's no ornamentation or fuss on their costumes. They're all incredibly stripped back. Hopefully there's always one or two things about the way they're dressed that the audience can identify with from their world or from global culture and history. Something to attach onto that gives them meaning. So these characters don't just feel like sci-fi action figures, but real, relatable characters that, like you and I, have their good days and their bad days, their struggles and their triumphs." I think this is a really good way of highlighting what sets the rebellion apart and the rebel characters apart from the Empire and the Imperial characters. The rebels are a ragtag group of people that wear unique clothing expressing their specific cultures and alien worlds and whatnot.
But it still shows a stark contrast to the obsessive appearance control, blatant misogyny, and scientific racism that was so evident in fascist dress codes. Fashion is a lens through which we can gain a deeper understanding of oppression and resistance. A change of dress can transform a look from nationalist propaganda to anti-fascist resistance. And as the specter of modern-day fascism approaches, how will we use fashion to resist?
And this is just as relevant to the rebellion as it is to the Empire because, as I hope I have made clear, fashion is an important cultural expression both personally and politically for people all over the world, both real and fictional. And it doesn't necessarily have to be bad. But as Andor and fascist Italy and Nazi Germany all highlight, it certainly can be. Luckily, we don't have to worry about that anymore in the modern world, especially in the United States. Right?
My jeans are blue.
Sydney Sweeney has great jeans.
And I want to begin this section by saying that, first of all, this advertisement is exactly that. It's an advertisement. And what it's meant to do is stir up controversy on both sides of the political spectrum so that the company, American Eagle, can benefit from both outrage and support. So I don't really want to support or give credence to or a platform to the ad, which I guess I'm kind of doing, but just know that it's a stupid ad that is made to make money and it's working. So feed into this as little as you possibly can. Is the line "Sydney Sweeney has great genes" in the context of Sydney Sweeney 100% a eugenics dog whistle? Yes, it is. But with that said, is the line "Sydney Sweeney has great genes" in the context of Sydney Sweeney 100% not a dog whistle? No, it is not a dog whistle. Two things can be true at once, but mostly, yeah, it's a dog whistle. The point is that the ad can play it either way, and no matter how you interpret it, again, the company is winning. But I say that it is a dog whistle specifically because of the fact that Sydney Sweeney has been adopted as a far-right sex symbol, and she is 100% leaning into it. And the people behind this ad, Sydney Sweeney, her team, American Eagle, they're all aware of that. At least I would assume. They're just making a pun, yes, and they can hide behind the fact that they're making a pun, but also, like, it's a pun because it has a double meaning. It has, like, a double meaning from jeans to jeans, but also from, like, sex jeans to, well, eugenics genes, because they would not have run this ad with anyone else. They chose Sydney Sweeney for a specific reason. Because the right views Sydney Sweeney as a return to what women should be, specifically women in media. This is an echo of Mussolini and Hitler's views on women and Mussolini's efforts to control women's fashion and culture. It's the natural progression and response to and catering to body shaming and racism that you see a lot in video games and TV and movies, and specifically Gamergate and guys like The Critical Drinker. Most importantly, it also supports a theory that I've had for a really long time, that conservative men are more interested in, in breasts, and liberal men are more interested in ass. Tell me what you think of this theory in the comments, because I've been on this for years, and I feel like this whole Sydney Sweeney thing vindicates me. Anyway, none of this would even matter as much, and I probably wouldn't have included it unless the President of the United States himself were told by his handlers that this were going on, and he decided to weigh in on the topic after learning who Sydney Sweeney was. And again, I don't want to feed into this nonsense because it's all just a distraction from the important thing, the Epstein files, but it is relevant in the context of politics because here we do have an actress, an important part of current American culture and fashion, being appropriated by a far-right political party which is currently in power and being used in a roundabout way to oppress dissent. Specifically because Donald Trump is using Sydney Sweeney as a contrast to Taylor Swift, who he's claiming now is no longer hot, both in the physical sense, but also I feel like in the media sense, specifically because she is not a political ally of his and he's deranged and cannot stop thinking or talking about her. Point is, this is an example of the right wing attempting to control the narrative and control culture through lies. In this case, lies about sexuality, culture, and fashion.
Italian fascism was a cult of male sexuality, one that wanted to ignore women as much as it wanted to subjugate them. When the fascist party did give attention to women, it was often to parade them as objects of propaganda. The Great Parade of Female Forces is a 1939 documentary showcasing a women's rally in Rome that was organized by Mussolini. The footage heavily features young, slender women wearing sports uniforms who are participating in various physical activities. We can see the fascist obsessions with virility, athleticism, and conformity on full display.
So now, to return to the original question, we have to once again ask ourselves, will the fascists wear black robes? Well, it will not always be so simple or black and white, both in real life and in media. But there is a specific reason that fascists wear the figurative or sometimes literal black robes. The black robes highlight conformity and purpose. Stormtroopers, the ISB, directors in the Empire, Nazis, Mussolini's black shirt fascists. Fascist regimes are basically, at their core, cults. Cults maintain a hierarchy, show disdain for the individual, and require devotion to a central leader while denigrating what they perceive as the outgroup. And what easier way to perceive the outgroup as, hey, they don't look like us. And what easier way to make sure they don't look like you than by differentiating yourself from them, or vice versa, with clothing. And sure, while the fascists are likely to wear black robes, they could be wearing something else as well. They might wear black robes, they might wear black shirts, they might wear brown shirts, maybe they wear white armor, maybe they wear lightning bolts, maybe they wear blue jeans, or I guess if they really want to switch things up, they could even wear red hats.